Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jesus Lara. I'm an associate professor in the Syrian Regional Planning section here at the Knowlton School. And tonight I have the privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Clara Irazábal-Zurita. Dr. Irazábal is the director of Latina Studies Program and professor of planning with tenure in the Department of Architecture, Urban Planning, and Design at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Before joining University of Missouri, Kansas City, Dr. Irazábal was the Latin Lab Director and Associate Professor of Urban Planning in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. Dr. Irazábal has a PhD and Master's in Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, and a Master's of Urban Design and Planning from the Central University of Venezuela. In her research and teaching, she explores the interactions of culture, politics, and placemaking, and their impact on community development and social spatial justice in Latin American cities and Latino immigrant communities in the United States. Dr. Irazábal has published academic work in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. She's the author of Governance and City Making in the Americas, Curitiba and Portland, published in 2005. She's the editor of Transbordering Latin Americas, Liminal Places, Cultures, and Powers Here, published by Routledge in 2014. And she's also the editor of Ordinary Places, Extraordinary Events, Citizenship, Democracy, and Public Spaces in Latin America, published by Routledge in 2008. She has published over 70 peer-reviewed journals and book chapters as well. Dr. Irazábal has worked as a consultant, researcher, and professor in multiple countries in the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Let's welcome Dr. Clara Irazábal-Zurita.
Thank you very much, Jesus, Thais, Michael, everybody that has been involved in making it possible for me to be here. I know that there are a lot of people that work behind curtains for these things to happen. I'm very thankful to you all, and I'm having a blast here. I spent part of my afternoon walking around campus, and let me tell you, it is impressive. I've been around, I've worked in several universities, and I have visited plenty, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. And this is very impressive. You have fabulous facilities, and I hope that you're taking care of them and making the most out of it, taking advantage of what you have here. And let me get a sense of who's here today. So who are here from architecture, the architecture program? Who's here from landscape? Just two people, I think that's so. You have to make a lot of noise. And who's here from planning? And who else do we have from other disciplines? Well, okay, we have plenty here, and I think that I have something for each of you. So let's see how it goes. I've done a lot of work in Latin America. About half of my work is in Latin America, several countries there, including Brazil, that we're going to cover today. And the other half is about immigrant and Latino communities here in the United States, particularly in the Southwest, but I have done some work in the East Coast and now in the Midwest where I live. I currently live in Kansas City. This is my third year living there, experimenting in the Midwest. So I'm here to share with you some experience that I have had with social housing movements in Brazil, how we see that they struggle for the right to housing, how far they get in that struggle, what type of methods they use, and what does it have to do with architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning, right? Hopefully it moves us in the manner that it moved me. This is not something that I do in terms of research. This is something that I am and that I feel very deeply. What I'm sharing with you is something that I care very deeply, and I hope that I can convey that to you tonight. And this is actually a picture of one of the land occupations that I visited with master's students from the urban planning at Columbia University in the city of New York, where I was teaching at the time in 2016. One of the many occupations that we visited in our field trip while we were doing a planning studio, a semester studio about this matter. So I'm going to be telling you what I mean by land grabbing. A lot of the social sciences literature is covering this material nowadays in a number of ways, and what is then the counter land grabbing that these social housing movements are enacting. Then who are they? Who are the members of these social housing movements? What I'm calling the Precariat, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then they are responding to the issue of lack of housing, the housing crisis that is immense in Brazil, but it is also immense here in the United States and in many other places around the world, call them the Global South or the Global North. And then how do they justify that they occupy buildings and land in other places that might seem like a criminal act to do, at least illegal, right? But they have the backing of the laws in the case of Brazil, and that's phenomenal. The laws in Brazil are very progressive in that sense, something that I think we can learn from here in the States. They use what I'm calling restorative justice. They haven't called it yet, but I will tell you what I mean when I call it that way. And I think it's a method that we in our spatial disciplines, architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning, we could embrace, we could integrate, and it could lead us to very interesting results when we deal with communities. They use a number of planning tools. I'll introduce the most important ones. They face enormous obstacles. This is no walk in the park, so you will appreciate that, and ultimately that brings us challenges as people that are in formation for these spatial disciplines that you represent here, right? So hopefully we can reflect together about what it means for us at the end. Who has been in Brazil? A few. Sao Paulo in particular? Okay, very well. As an introduction, you know we have South America here. We are all part of this big continent. In the rest of the Americas, we actually call America in singular to the entire continent. So in this part of America, we have Brazil, the largest of countries in South America, and in there to the south, we have the state of Sao Paulo and the city itself of Sao Paulo. This is the metropolitan area. This is the city itself. And Sao Paulo city has over 12 million inhabitants, so much larger than Columbus. And the metropolitan area, over 21 million inhabitants. And perhaps those are undercounts because there are many people in squatter settlements or the sort that are hard to be sensed. So what is land grabbing? Land grabbing, as the name suggests, is the taking of large tracts of land. And it has been a part and parcel of the history of Brazil from the inception of the country. At the beginning, in the 1500s, the Portuguese enacted colonial power over Brazil. And they did all sorts of tricks to get their hands into the land of Brazil, not importing the indigenous communities that were living there at the time. One of the things that they did that I have to tell you about because it's just, I think it will blow your mind, is this what it's called grilleros. They put paper that supposedly were the deeds of the lands in boxes full of crickets, so that the cricket messed with the paper and made them appear as if they were old and genuine pieces of property. And they grab a lot of millions and millions of tracts of land in that manner. That didn't stop there, but at the turn of the 19th century, we started the modernization process that brought about enormous changes in agriculture and elsewhere, and a lot of intervention on the part of larger corporations and even countries nowadays, with the transition to globalization and more recently neoliberalization, we have countries, including the United States, but not exclusively, that are leasing or buying land in other countries so that they can grow different types of foods or biofuel, actually. And that Brazil is at the top of the list that in countries that have been facilitating this process to happen. But then, starting in the 1960s, because of the lack of agrarian reform in Brazil and because land was in the hands of too few people, about 3% of the population had 3/4 of the land of Brazil, people started rebelling, resisting that sort of order, and started to build social movements. First in the rural areas, the landless movement, which started in the 60s and today continues on and constitutes the largest social movement we have in the world, enacting occupations of land that are not fruitful so that people can grow their foods there. And more recently, in the 80s, the urban branch of such movements started in cities in Brazil, and that's what we're covering in this presentation. And they started occupying land in the periphery of the cities, and also buildings that were vacant or underutilized, lots that were vacant and underutilized in central areas of the city. We have the phenomenon in Latin American cities in which the central area of the city was also vacated when people started to move to suburbs. And those buildings are now, some of those are occupied by these type of movements that are using the support of the laws of Brazil that enact the right to the city and the right to housing. There are many negative impacts of land grabbing by big corporations or big powerful countries over others. They produce land and housing insecurity because they do not consider the population that was living there. They produce, therefore, displacement. Those people have to move elsewhere, and they might lose everything they had, dispossession, unemployment, underemployment of local people. Usually those deals are not really deals, they are grabs. There are no negotiated compromises, so shady processes of negotiation, no local consultation, sometimes no compensation whatsoever, or very bad compensation for the people that lose their land and sometimes their livelihood that way. And ultimately, some people talk about neo-colonialism altogether, a renewed economic imperialism of developed and BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, over developing nations. It's a system that we haven't fully overcome, that of colonialism, that is brought back to Brazil and to many other places in these new ways now. Whereas the counter land grabbing operated by the social movements that are occupying land because they have no other place to go, restores land and housing security, brings that back to the people that need it, usually induces more just processes of negotiation, better compensation, environmental stewardship, food sovereignty, and country sovereignty in some instances, the right to self-decide and enact their own development. It's this type of contrast that I see between the land grabbing by the powerful and the land grabbing or counter land grabbing by the powerless when they work together in an organized manner and in numbers. And this is the metropolitan area of Sao Paulo that you saw previously. And this is the mapping of some of the occupations that have been done by the roofless housing movement, the Movimiento dos Trabalhadores Sem Teto, the roofless workers movement in Brazil. In this case, 20 occupations or so of 17,000 people registered representing households that can be of 4 people or more. So millions of people are mobilized in this manner, because this is just representing Sao Paulo, but this is happening elsewhere in Brazil too. This is the occupation, and in the case of the movement that I investigated, they prefer to go to the periphery, because in there they can have tracts of land that they can occupy. They are nearby the people that are part of their movement, and they can also attract other people to become part of the movement, or at least to become part of the occupation and grow their strength in numbers. And if they are successful in converting this occupation into social housing projects, then they also bring new amenities to all the region around that usually lack all sorts of infrastructure. So they can bring the development of new roads, new schools, new pipes for water and sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. And who are they? Who are the members of this group? People like the one you see represented here in this picture. A lot of people that are Afro-descendant in Brazil, because there is a lot of racism there too, as much as we have here in the United States. Many female-headed households, because there is a problem also with the men and parenthood in Brazil, as we have in the United States. And people that do not have the means to participate in the regular housing market available in the capitalist economy that is running the country. And they get together a number of different types of movements to support each other in coalitions, and they do demonstrations and marches and picket fences and all sorts of demonstrations to convey the need that exists, to build those sort of coalitions, to call attention to a larger public that can constitute allies to their movement and support their causes, and ultimately, hopefully, eventually house many of these people. And the proletariat, we know from Marxist that the proletariat is that who sells their labor to live. They are wage earners, right? But in the case of the precariat, we are talking about people that do not have jobs most of the time, or if they have jobs, is in an intermittent type of ways, and it might be underpaid, so they might be underemployed. So that the type of social pyramid that we recognize, not only for the case of Brazil, but actually also for the case of the United States, in which we have the 1% elite on top, the shrinking middle class in the middle, and the large and growing proletariat at the bottom of the pyramid, is now expanded and growing underground with a new class that is much larger, that is the precariat. This is the circumstance that we have in Brazil. And this is the people that, for example, the British economist has called the new dangerous class, that consists of a multitude of insecure people living bits and pieces lives in and out of short-term jobs without a narrative of occupational development. Denizens. They have more restricted range of social, cultural, political, and economic rights than citizens around them. And why would they be a dangerous class? They're a dangerous class because they can go against the status quo. They can become a struggle for a new type of social order. And that's the case that we're seeing with the social housing movements in Brazil. The Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben talks about homo saucer, that is Latin for accursed man, something that comes from ancient Roman law, in which a person could be deemed as non-person, as an animal. Therefore, anybody could hurt or even kill that person with no consequence whatsoever. That's the type of appreciation of members of this group on the part of the larger society in Brazil. He also talks about the concept of bare life, bodies stripped of their human and political dignities. Bodies, entities that breathe, entities that have biological function, but that do not have any status, a political, civil status to recognize as a bearer of rights. And therefore, following this type of conceptions, we can think of Brazil's precariat as a non-fully human, non-fully political body, a non-citizen, or at best a sub-citizen. And I'm referring here to the way they are perceived by some of the institutions, the people in power in Brazil, and members of the larger society. But they are reacting to a crisis that is enormous and that is not only affecting them, the precariat, but the larger society. In Brazil, it is estimated that more than 6 million units of housing are lacking. And the bulk of it, more than 83% of that need, is in the stratum of society that receive 0 to 3 minimum wages. And the minimum wage in Brazil is ridiculous. It's something nobody can live on. An individual cannot live on a minimum wage. And if you receive 0, you have nothing whatsoever. But with 3, you cannot do much. So this is the lowest stratum, the precariat. 83% of the need for housing is concentrated there. And it happens at the level of the country, at the level of the state of Sao Paulo, and it's repeated at the level of the metropolitan area of Sao Paulo, where 80% of the need is concentrated in the precariat, but the need is over 500,000 units at least. And there is also a qualitative housing deficit. In the United States, we pay a lot of attention to the quantitative housing deficit, and some cities are good at estimating how many more units of housing do we need to construct, or how many more of those would need to be affordable at what level, so that the need is covered. But we don't pay necessarily much attention to these aspects of precariousness, cohabitation, or overcrowdedness, excessive rent burden, and excessive densification, therefore are not well served in terms of the habitat, not the house unit itself. And those things are significant also to realize that a person can be housed, but in a manner that is not fully dignified, and that's a deficit in and of itself. And what is the rationale? How do they justify the social housing movements that they occupy land or buildings? Well, they have the backing of the constitution itself of the country, and then a number of other laws that derive from it. In the federal constitution, it says that property shall serve a social function. And Brazil is not the only constitution that says that. Some European constitutions and other Latin American constitutions do so. Colombian constitution go farther to say that property shall serve not only a social but also an environmental function, meaning that private property is not an absolute right, but is constrained by the need of the larger society if there is something that you need to do to, for example, supply housing or supply, better air quality of, or water quality or something else of that nature. And then the statute of the city, that is also a federal law, states the right to decent housing and the prevalence of common interest over individual property rights. Again, the same idea that everybody needs to have at least the minimum to live a dignified life, and then you can do what you want, more or less, with your private property, but not before that. And how do they go about doing that? this is where restorative justice comes in, that I argue is a new planning mode or type of operation. In planning theory, for the planners among us here, I bet that you have known about the rational planning mode, right? It's supposed to be following some sort of scientific method, if you wish. The experts are the ones that plan. They have technical expertise. They have the data that is supporting the decisions that are made. All decisions are laid out and evaluated, and the best course of action is taken, right? Very rational altogether. But we know that method has good things, but it has its limitations too. So planners said we need to be more democratic about making decisions, right? Planning needs to be more participatory. Let's bring the people in. And then this is about democracy, and this is about the process, how we take decisions and who's participating in that conversation. But other people said, well, that's not sufficient either, because we have some historical debts with some groups of people that we need to serve no matter what. For example, housing the homeless, right? Are we going to continue debating forever how we go about it, or are we actually going to do it, right? And some people said, let's have a method that we will call advocacy planning, in which we're going to go directly for the results. Let's do it. It doesn't matter if it is democratically decided or not, just let's do it because it's needed. So they have flaws, all of them. The rational planning doesn't have concern for democracy or equity. The participatory planning doesn't have concern for results. You can have a very participatory conversation and a very democratic system and ultimately get to results that are only perpetuating injustice, if not worse. So you really have to pay attention to the results as well. But this advocacy planning doesn't focus on the process altogether. And it makes sense that people participate in decision making. And it makes sense that people have a voice. So it's not that we have to throw the baby with the bathwater and forget about process altogether, right? So how is it that we can combine all of the needs that are of interest to us? Process, results, and some sense of the rational. I think that restorative justice can help us get that, because it brings the participatory processes from participatory practice and the sense or the need and the focus on equitable results from advocacy planning. And let me tell you how it does that. You start with an injustice. People that are homeless in Brazil and that do not have any way of getting into the formal housing market there. That's an injustice. You have an intervention, which is the social housing movements occupying land. With that intervention, they bring the people that are the stakeholders together, because the landowner will show up, the city people planners will show up, and then they will sit together with the social housing movements and they negotiate and they say, well, you're out of order. The Constitution says that the land should have a social function, and you have had your land vacant for a decade or so. And on top of that, you haven't paid taxes on your property. So you're delinquent with the law that way as well. And the city that is supposed to be serving their constituencies but hasn't paid attention to the homeless is forced to see them face to face and bring about the right that is enacted in the city statute and in the Constitution, that the land should have a social function and that housing is a human right. So they are not following the law, and the social housing movement brings that to their attention, and there are, in many instances, not all of them, but in sufficient number of instances, they come to an accord. and the owner sells the land to the city or to a developer, or develops it himself or herself, and in many occasions is for a social housing program, because Brazil also has support for public housing with a big national program that they call My House, My Life, Minha Casa, Minha Vida. So there are monies to do this type of projects there. So they had that public dialogue. They put the collective rights over the individual rights. They come to agreements to restore order, to restore the injustice, and ultimately the injustice is overcome. That's what restorative justice is about. It's not a process about castigating anybody, but a process about figuring out what's the responsibility that everybody has on a particular circumstance that is unjust, and how is it that we can all have an opportunity to contribute to solve it. They use many planning tools that in Brazil, I told you, were fairly progressive to support housing for the people. Among them, zoning, taxation, the public housing program that I just mentioned, and ultimately, professionals like many of you here that support this type of work. Zoning, they have this zoning that is more progressive than what we call inclusionary zoning here in the United States. They call it zonas especiales de interés social, special areas of social interest in which they can zone the squatter settlements, for example, so that they are protected from speculation when they are in a process of gentrification, which has happened to many in cities in Brazil, or they can select other type of land that is vacant in the city and convert that into the social function of housing provision for the poor. There are several variations to that. One case study is that of the occupation that I have been showing to you that is called Nova Palestina, New Palestine. The naming of this occupation is actually fairly revealing in and of itself. In the case of this occupation, they settled in a protected area, and they couldn't have more than 10% of that land developed. But in the process of negotiation with the city, they turned it in the new master plan into essays, one of these special zones for now 30% of the area can be built. And the social housing movement itself said, we are going to take care of the 70% of land that will continue to be devoted to the forest that exists there. So they are the stewards of the nature that will be supported in this land. And in that manner, more than 8,000 people got their right to housing supported, and they got to participate in the way that it's going to be designed. You have taxation, progressive taxation, in which you convey a notice to a landowner that has a lot vacant and says, listen, you have to do something with your property. Either you sell it or you build something with it. Or if not, you're going to receive higher and higher taxes for up to 5 years. If 5 years pass by and they don't do anything with the land, then the city can expropriate it through eminent domain, compensating that owner for that. And in that manner, many people have been notified in Sao Paulo, and some lots have been recovered and turned back into social housing, for example, through a land bank. The properties that are expropriated are put into a land bank, and that in turn is land that is given to the public housing program in place in Brazil. Many units have been built in that manner too. But it is not sufficient. You remember that the deficit is enormous, so you have to get this housing here and others there and put all of these type of tools together so that they can create synergies and produce the numbers that you really need. The social housing program, the Mi Casa Mi Vida, has produced a number of housings, but the ones, there is a particular fragment of that program that works with nonprofit organizations, professionals that are socially minded, communities themselves organized, in which the communities design the habitat that they want to produce and actually build them and manage it as well. But only a very tiny fraction of the monies and the number of housings that have been produced in that manner, whereas the rest has been a cookie cutter type of production of housing that has been too badly made and too small to serve the needs of these people. And this is a case in which they produce the buildings and they design them with the architects and the landscape architects and the planners, and they are part of the movement and they feel super incorporated in that manner in those processes. And they build units that are much larger than the ones that are produced in that cookie cutter manner by large corporations. And they are well served and they have all the amenities that are required, and they are mixed use, which is something that is not seen much in this type of developments as well, that unfortunately are exclusively residential in most cases. And lastly, socially responsible professionals, people that in firms that they put together in nonprofits through internships that the schools, the public schools in Sao Paulo and elsewhere in Brazil have programs. They support professionally these enterprises and build designs that are train the people that construct these type of projects and do that with them together. And this is something that what they have done, professionals working together with communities and using the support of the social housing program in Brazil. This is well said and done, but not necessarily it's easy to produce. It has, the social housing movement have many obstacles. Perhaps the greatest of them all is that land continues to be considered only exclusively as a commodity that is in its exchange value in the market, and not with the inclusion also of appreciation for their use value. The fact that housing is necessary, that housing is a human right, that we all need some shelter, and that therefore some of it has to be produced outside the market with other type of mechanisms. Insufficient political power that the social housing movements have and their members, that unfortunately, even though they have big numbers and that they do have allies and that they have had good relationship with the previous government in Brazil, they haven't fully gotten the type of top-down support that will bring this movement to the next level and the effects that they have in housing production to the next level. The criminalization and dehumanization of the members, that some have been, well, imprisoned, but some others have been raped and tortured, and some disappeared, which means they have been killed just because they have been participating in occupations. And unfortunately, they are treated as terrorists. For example, in this news, you see justice arrest members of landless movements based on anti-terrorist law. And this was happening before the coup d'etat in Brazil in 2016 that has brought about people in power that are doing that to a larger extent, to say the least. And Brazil is immersed in a very heavy political and economic crisis at the moment, and they just recently elected the president about a week ago that is not going to bring relief, I think, to the conditions in place, let alone for the poorest of the poor. So times doesn't look very hopeful for the near future at the least, but the movements are committed to continue their struggle. And what I will say, the Trump effect, perhaps, that election of Bolsonaro and the fact that he has already threatened to treat occupiers as terrorists with 30-year jail time, the maximum that is allowed in Brazil. And these are just news of this week. So what would be the next steps then if we wanted to support the right to housing? I think it would be important to try to protect and to claim and reclaim the rights enacted in the Constitution and the other federal and local laws in Brazil, put the existing planning tools into action. Some of them haven't been fully implemented, or they have variety of levels of implementations in different cities in Brazil. Reinstate and expand the housing program that exists, Minha Casa Minha Vida, particularly that piece of it that works with communities directly, empower social movements with recognition, with lack of persecution, with support, including financial for programming, promote and demand solidarity and reconciliation so that restorative justice can be enacted, because restorative justice only operates if there is that recognition of the humanity of the others and the needs of the other. Expand research and advocacy, and that is a call for us, people in academia. If we can bring visibility to these processes and also support professionally what is being done in order to bring about the right to housing and the right to the city for the people, I think that we will be perhaps performing our duty in that sense. Reform professional education to promote social responsibility, and I think that perhaps this conversation tonight is part of that, what you're doing here with the program and the internships and the field works that you have both domestically and internationally, I think are also getting at that. So I celebrate that in this school and hope that you can continue nurturing it. My final thoughts is that I think restorative justice should be part of the canon as a method in planning, if not also in landscape architecture and in architecture. It tackles structural poverty and inequality. It makes visible the invisible, what we're not dealing with. It incentivizes everybody to participate in restoring justice, realizing that we are all in it together, and that we all therefore need to appreciate our own responsibility in the injustices that exist, but also our own power to overcome them. It's grassroots based, and in the case of Brazil, for the poor, by the poor, and rooted in the Brazilian Constitution and the rest of laws there. Thank you very much.
So now we're going to open up to some questions. Anybody? Any questions for? Go ahead, start.
You could say, what is one key takeaway from this presentation?
That's a question for you. What do you think it would?
Or anybody that can help.
I would say start the mission.
What would be one takeaway from the presentation, right?
Also, for me, it would probably be starting to like in terms of people. Don't make it just
Can you repeat that for the people in the back?
So my answer for the key takeaway was start to utilize the method. So in terms of the Constitution, start to listen to it, expose it to both people. That way, like text won't be and that way the rules are
Anybody else? Go ahead.
I was wondering, the movement party? Is that property? In addition to Bolsonaro's ideology, is that probably a reason targeting
Yes, there's a lot of political polarization in Brazil, and it has grown dramatically in recent years, and most particularly because of the type of discourse that the candidate Bolsonaro, now the president-elect, has brought to the public arena. And yes, the movement had ties to the Partido de los Trabajadores, the Workers' Party, that had been ruling Brazil previous to this. And some of the people that got to power were actually coming from the movement, including ex-President Lula. Not this particular movement that we talked about here, but other social movements of the time and of Sao Paulo. So the ties were very direct and effective, not only effective but effective as well.
Any more questions? Go ahead.
How are these initiatives or these projects similar or different from others?
They are very different because the favelas regularly grow organically by incremental decisions that are individual, of an individual or an individual household. So they usually lack pre-planning, and that is why it's very difficult and often very expensive to serve them after the fact with infrastructure. Put the streets and the piping that is required to bring services to the favelas. In this case, they do these occupations that are impermanent. They are just there to create a presence in the land, but once they negotiate the land transformation, they go for a full formal project that will have all the considerations of infrastructure from the very beginning, so it's planned.
Follow-up question on that. First of all, I love the presentation, the private property innovations and incorporating social interests into the conception of private property. I'm meeting with you tomorrow, I'm going to nerd out with you on that. I think it's just tremendous. I'm also going to steal your slide on rational versus participatory versus advocacy planning. But you position restorative justice as a way to kind of have the best of both worlds, both participatory and advocacy, sort of the equity in the process. But you sort of throw out the rational planning process, at least on your slide. And I was wondering, in the case of New Palestine, the settlement, you have a case where an area that was protected environmentally to protect the trees. And then you have housing movement coming in, and the amount of land that's protected is reduced from the amount of land that's allowed to be developed goes from 10% to 30%. How do we know that, assuming that the protection of the trees is a rational sort of objective good, or at least a public good, how do we know that the new inhabitants will actually protect that land? In some of the areas I work in Haiti and Bolivia, low-income individuals oftentimes need the trees in order to use them for fuel. And that temptation to get through the day, the week, or the month to take down those trees, how do we know that this social housing movement will still serve the social interest on the environmental side?
Well, nobody knows the future, so I cannot promise you that that will be the case, but that was part of the negotiations. They did agreements, perhaps they signed papers in which they committed to doing that. And what I can tell you is that there is a lot of discipline within the movement. These are not disorganized people. These are people that are trained. They receive a lot of class. They are in constant training while they are in the occupations. They have assignments. They need to comply with certain rules and regulations. They need to be committed to attending the meetings. They need to be committed to the particular function that they are assigned to. There is a lot of discipline in here. So I would trust that that discipline can take care of this matter.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Go ahead.
You mentioned
Well, yes. Just as we see in our cities here, the pressures of gentrification in many cases and land speculation expressing otherwise, that's happening in Brazilian cities as well, and it's all the more present in Sao Paulo, which is the economic capital of the country. Not the political, but the economic capital of the country. So that's a challenge that is not solved in any way completely, and it always presents itself in variations that are hard to catch up with. But this special zone of social interest that I presented is trying to provide some sense of contentment to that, because it creates this, it designates whether lots or buildings or larger pieces of land that are prevented from that speculation, that are taken out of the formal market if you wished. But you need political will backing that up at all times. So some of that is lost when a new administration comes in, for example. And all of that is threatened, unfortunately, at the moment with the new administration that is coming in.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. So since this is a spatial settlement rooted in a social movement, I was wondering if you could comment on the extent that digital participation through civic engagement has not played a role to the extent that Precariat is organized, involved in generating support for social movement.
Well, as in any other place, I think perhaps around the world, the digital participation in bringing about the movement and bringing about pop-up demonstrations and the sort has been enormously big in Brazil, enormously big. I haven't done research on the matter, but I bet it would be a very fertile area to consider in more detail.
My impression is that favelas are quite often located more centrally located, so they also spread out to the fringes of cities. But one of the reasons because of that is better location for transport and jobs and economic prosperity. So I was curious with this advocacy planning, it seems that it's pushed perhaps more to the fringes and the edges of the city. I was curious if that was true or if they are centrally located as well too. If they're on the fringes, what's the connection to transport and or economic
Yeah, this particular movement that we spoke about tonight, the workers' roofless movement is their name, prefers to occupy large pieces of land in the periphery. But there are other social housing movements that exclusively focused on occupying buildings in central areas of the city because they want to take advantage of the infrastructure that is already in place and the proximity to job markets and the sort. So they complement each other, and they often support each other in their different ways of going about the struggle for housing. The movements also have varieties in the way that they negotiate with authorities. Some of them allow for their members to become part of planning institutions or governmental institutions of other sort, and some others absolutely prohibit it because they feel it's a way of co-opting the movement and diluting them eventually. So they have enormously complex philosophies and traditions that differ from one to the next, but they also manage to find ways of appreciating, respecting, and supporting each other in manners that really move the struggle forward.
One more question we have for one more. Okay. So just I want to announce tomorrow, Professor Balmasa has organized a Q&A with Professor Irazábal-Zurita. Knowlton, what is the room?
Room 176 from 11 to noon. So if you want to have more informal interaction with the professor as well, or ask follow-up questions that come to you as we fall through today, we should ask. Please join us 11 to noon here at first floor, room 176.
And it doesn't have to be about my work tomorrow. It can actually be about yours, you telling me what you're interested in. I would love to hear that.
Okay, thank you, Clara.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.